I want you to consider how recently bloodletting was a thing. How doctors used to really think that by bleeding a patient, you were making him healthier. And of course, there are instances where that might be the case still, but it was founded on this completely bogus notion of how much blood somebody had in their body, and of what the blood was doing to you while you were ill, and of how quickly you were remaking new, fresh, good blood. An example of somebody who was very famous, who died of bloodletting, is George Washington. George Washington seems to have contracted some sort of cold or something like that that led to a flu or fever or possibly strep, some kind of an infection from catching cold while he was out checking out his land. Man, we keep bringing up George Washington here, huh? And his doctors, clearly some of the best doctors in the nation at the time, just, 200 some odd years ago, came out and started bleeding George. And every time that it seemed like he might be recovering, then having some sort of relapse, they'd bleed him again because, he was getting better after we bled him last time. He was getting better for some days, and then this fever comes back, and let's bleed him again. And George Washington's last words were, "I die hard." The dude died of being bled to death. In fact, one of the doctors who was there on site actually suggested putting in the blood of some pig and massaging it through his body to try and bring him back to life, basically because he couldn't stand the fact that George Washington had died, and he had this little theory. Anyway, they didn't try it. That would be a totally different kind of story, wouldn't it? Doctors felt like bloodletting was a completely logical practice because they had just enough patients get better from bloodletting. That it just so happened that there was a very high percentage of patients who did survive this process. That after nights and days of bleeding someone and watching them start climbing back to health and having some kind of relapse and bleeding them again, that just enough of them were able to pull through, not because of the bloodletting, but despite it. And doctors found that some patients just took much longer and had to have much more blood drawn, but other patients, that they died anyway, that the disease was just too strong, despite their heroic efforts of taking blood out of the body of their patient. The point that I'm trying to make is that this was a faulty cause and effect, that the doctors saw through their own experience patients survive despite being bled by drastic amounts. At the time, they thought that people had about twice as much blood in their body as they do, so they could bleed somebody to very near dry. It's a horrifying practice to imagine being stuck in these days, and we're all lucky enough that it has fallen out of favor. But there's all sorts of things throughout history that are full of these faulty cause and effects, and it just so happens that medical science is absolutely rife with it. And like another example is a doctor who felt like he had a sixth sense for who would come down with diphtheria. That he was just certain that he could tell when somebody was susceptible to diphtheria, and everybody sort of trusted him. He had this gut instinct that was unbelievable. And so what he would do is he would say to, somebody on the street or somebody who comes in and say, "You know what, I think that you might fall victim to this diphtheria thing going around. Let me check your tonsils and your adenoids and your tongue and stuff." And he'd pull out his equipment and he would check their tonsils and their stuff. And he'd say, "Yeah, I'm not seeing anything right now, but if you feel anything funny, you come back." And the patient would come back a few days later, in the throes of diphtheria, a deadly disease, and they would die. And he'd be like, "See, I told them. I just knew this person was susceptible to diphtheria." And everybody around him was like, "Dude, you're sort of amazing at this. You totally know when people have diphtheria." And if you're wondering what the connection here is, he was not cleaning his equipment. So when he would inspect someone's mouth, when he would palpate their tongue and look to the back of their throat, he was using equipment that had been used on diphtheria patients moments ago. And so his sixth sense was just that he was going to give somebody diphtheria, not that he was going to protect anyone from it. Again, this faulty cause and effect. Our brains are wired for cause and effect, and we see it all over the place, and we see it all the time, and in most instances, we're able to sort of piece together things in the right way and live a perfectly logical, normal life. Learning to drive is a good example. When you learn how to drive, you get these little rewards every time you do something right. It feels nice, it feels smooth, it feels safe. And you get these little punishments every time that things go wrong. And that feedback is so instantaneous that you know when you're improving all by yourself. You don't even have to have a teacher there yelling at you. Walking is sort of the same thing, I suppose, when you're much younger, that you can tell when you're doing it right, and you can tell when you ain't, and that reward comes through. A good example of a faulty cause and effect with these things is pilot training. That there is a lot of research that suggests that the more you praise someone on their effort, not on the job they've done necessarily, but on their effort, that the better they do, the better they respond to that training that you're giving them. However, we've seen with pilot training that those trainers have all sort of come to the agreement, this may be said maybe of military trainers in general, that it's better to punish than reward, that they respond better to punishment, that they do something wrong, they get yelled at, and then they do it better next time. Conversely, they've also noticed that when somebody does something especially great and they praise them, that they don't do as well the next time. So the trainers are not being rewarded by rewarding the people they're training, and they do feel rewarded by punishing the people that they train. So yelling for doing it especially bad and rewarding for doing it especially wrong feels like two totally different processes. But what they're missing here is this very interesting phenomenon that we're going to talk about on a later lecture called regression to the mean, which basically is something that I've been saying for a long time, that on average everything is average. So when somebody does something especially bad, the chances of them repeating something especially poorly are lower. Chances are they're going to do a little bit more average next time, which is a little bit better. And when somebody does something especially good, especially skillful, especially impressive, chances are they're going to average out a little bit next time and be not quite so good. They're going to be a little closer to that average. And so those trainers are, again, mistaking this cause and effect, that they're seeing something that is a totally natural phenomenon, that on average their trainees are average, and they're mistaking the way that their relationship is working with their training. But it doesn't stop with there. Common people in common everyday things do have really weird systems that misinform them about their cause and effect. But the truth of the matter is that most people are extremely confident with their opinions and extremely confident with their experience and extremely confident with what it is that they are thinking. Thinking is actually something that is hard to do, that takes time and concentration to do. And I'm talking again about this system 2 thinking and not that system 1 reaction. If there is no other reason for you to take algebra, for you to study parallelograms, for you to understand deep mathematics, then let that reason be that you are learning how to turn off system 1 and turn on system 2. To turn off that whole instinctive reactionary thought process and to turn on a slow, deep thinking process that will help you calculate out answers. This isn't a transparent lesson, obviously. In your math class, this has probably not been framed to you this way. And it seems like the very direct lesson here of learning something should be that it's applicable to you later in life. But that's not really how learning works. As a matter of fact, for a lot of people, they're able to get through college or any sort of school thing without really learning. What I mean is that they're able to embed just enough information in System 1 that they don't ever have to turn on System 2, and they can sort of just slide through those lessons without having to sort of integrate it into their thinking systems. They don't change their thinking systems, they just react well enough that it feels like you're being rewarded for just naturally who you are. And that's why it gets so frustrating for teachers when we have a student come into, writing level 2 and we have to go over what they learned in writing level 1. We're like, guys, didn't you learn this? Didn't you learn how to make a thesis? Didn't you learn how to cite your sources? And they kind of didn't. They kind of just embedded that stuff up front just for this moment, or else they used some sort of a reference sheet or something, and they didn't embed it into their deep thinking. They did not learn how to turn off that System 1 when they sat down to write and to turn on System 2. Now, for me as a writing teacher, I can forget that that's a thing because I've done so much writing in my life that writing feels very much like a System 1 process. When you write hours and hours a day for many, many days, it starts to become a skill that is up front in your immediate memory, rather than something that's deeply embedded. And so we sort of forget how to teach students that what we're trying to do here is get to those deeper regions of your brain, those smarter regions, those more intellectual regions, and to turn off those regions of your brain that's just responding to the stress of the moment. That the stress caused to you by this assignment, the stress caused to you by this classroom atmosphere, that responding to that through your survival mechanisms is very System 1. And you're able to scramble out of it, and you're able to have just enough chemical connections kick in that your System 1 can do things really, really well, but you don't make the material part of that deeper consciousness. Now, most of the problem with that doesn't lie with you, the student. It lies with you, the instructor. It lies with the way that we're teaching things, that we want to teach efficiently, that we are under pressure to teach efficiently, despite the fact that we know that learning is not an efficient process, that learning has starts and stops. It has tremendous leaps forwards and it has setbacks, that not all progress is in a straight line. We still want to see things go as efficiently as possible because we have a schedule and you have a schedule. We all want to stick with our schedule. We want to get to those outcomes. We want to check off our boxes and move on with our life because this is our life. And it's hard to frame your work as something that is improving someone's life and therefore worth that deep investment that it would take to really get into this material and let the student spend time with it and sit with it and think about it and integrate it into their life. Instead, we teach systems. We teach this outline process. You do A, B, C. Now connect A, B, and C. Now fill in the blanks with some research. Now here's how you fill in that research. All of that does not get to those deeper parts of your brain. You're following directions. And anybody can follow directions to do anything, pretty much. Now, I'm not saying that you can necessarily land a plane based on sitting on some headphones and taking the yoke from the pilot when he's passed out and listening to the air traffic controller give you directions on how to land a plane. However, we've all seen movies like that, and we all sort of expect that maybe we could pull this off if we tried real hard. And that's not necessarily leave that out of the equation. And what I am leaving out of the equation is all the automatic systems that come with landing a plane these days. So what I'm trying to get at is following directions is not learning, and we instead are falling back on a faulty cause and effect when we teach somebody how to systematically go through a process, and we teach them how to systematically address the material in the course, and we don't teach them those deeper thought processes that we are being rewarded we see the improvement, we see how somebody is replicating what we expected, and we are measuring their ability to follow these directions. Now, there's much to be said that's positive about following directions. There's much to be said that's very impressive about the way that our chemicals totally react to the ways in which we, with our brain chemistry, in order to get us from point A to point B in our brains without managing actual neuro change, without accessing that neuroplasticity of bringing neurons closer together. That's all real neat, but that's not what we're looking for. What we are looking for is an investment in that process. And that's where critical reasoning becomes really important. And I want to give you basically my thesis for this series of lectures. I want, through these lectures, to decrease your confidence in your automatic response. I want you to question whether or not you are correct when you instantly come up with an answer to something. And by contrast, what I would like you to do, by opening your mind to the cognitive errors that you're bound to make, the cognitive illusions that you fall for, and to the implicit bias that exists within your head, I want you to see how to turn off that automatic thinking. I want to increase your confidence in your ability to arrive at correct answers to a problem, a situation, a paper that you're writing, a point you're trying to prove, a topic you're trying to explore, by using your ability to think deeply, dissipating cognitive illusion, and combating your own bias. Now that's a mouthful of a thesis there, but I really invite you to understand what I'm getting at here. When we talk about being a skeptic, I've always seen myself as like somewhat of a believer. Like, you know, I remember in high school, we'd have conversations about Bigfoot or ghosts or UFOs, say, and I felt like skepticism sucked because I wanted those things to be in the world. I wanted to be a believer in those things. And I have no problem with that. I have no problem with believing in stuff like that. It doesn't bug me if somebody has had some sort of experience or has a memory that they want to explore through those things. I see no reason why those things should just be thrown out. However, what I mean about skepticism is not just doubt. It's not doubting, you know, the extraordinary or doubting the uncommon or anything like that. To me, that's somewhat of a negative connotation. That's somebody that sounds like they have a kind of a closed mind and isn't willing to explore and instead feels like they know what the picture of the world is like. What I mean by skepticism is the ability to stand a guard in your brain who is willing to flip that switch and make your lazy brain get off its butt and do some thinking, to do some deep exploration of some topic, to do some deep research, to bring in what the experts say, and to sort of reform the way that you interact with the world intellectually. That's what I'm seeing as the advantage of a skeptic, of somebody who stops what they're normally thinking and gets deep. This is what's so frustrating about reading scientific papers for most of us. Scientific papers want to arrive at a conclusion through a deep system of study of one or two variables, and it's so systematized and it's so skeptical that it can feel absolutely frustrating. It can feel like it's just like slogging through this material, and it's in a language that's very hard to digest. And conversely, when you read the summaries of these studies in a magazine or on a website or in a headline, and they seem like dynamic and sexy and cool and so easy to understand, yet those implications are often misinformed when you get really deep into the scientific literature that you're supposed to be reading. And that's because, once again, this is not an efficient process. Skepticism is not an efficient process. If we understand that we are available to these cognitive illusions and to these biases, then we have to systematize knowledge in a way that feels absolutely artificial and slow and cumbersome. And that's what I mean by being a skeptic, is coming at this with the idea that you know one thing for sure, and that is that your picture of the world is wrong. Your picture of the world is dead wrong. The world that you have in your mind that you think you are taking part of is not like the world that's out here that we're existing in. It is so common that most of us will never doubt our picture of the world. And in fact, we will hold it up and we will see it as a sort of version of ourselves that we are defending, and we will block out naysayers who come at us with new information, and we will not change our minds. And that's why we need it. That's why we need this skepticism. That's why we need scientific thinking. That's why we need critical reasoning, because we have to really control ourselves, or we are going to fall back on our faulty thinking and our poor evolution that has not led to dramatic leaps and bounds until we were able to put all of that aside, until you're able to question all of these different factors. And I mean factual factors, and I mean social factors, and I mean all sorts of other things that cloud into your judgment and paint this picture of a world that you're, for the most part, very comfortable with. Whatever it's full of. If it's full of these comfortable facts and comfortable truths, because those things feel good. And for the most part, we need to reject a lot of that. Now, the way that we have this confidence in what we think and what we believe can be seen in all sorts of places. We were talking about doctors and their faulty cause and effect, and how reluctant most doctors were to start washing their hands. So reluctant that there's devastating consequences to people in hospitals and in doctor examination rooms for hundreds of years. And it seemed like they were going to die anyway, and for the most part they weren't. For the most part, it's from the germs they were being exposed to. But you can see it now in marketing. You know, nothing's better than marketing for showing you the way that your world is different than the world that the marketers are seeing. They see your brain in a totally different light than you do. For example, after World War II, we found that people were very, very stuck on their brand of cigarette. Smoking had become just completely common. Smoking was seen in movies and TV, and people were picturing themselves smoking all the time, and it was cool. And the cigarette companies were impressed by the loyalty that people had. People wouldn't even try other cigarettes, and if they did try other cigarettes, they completely would balk at this and say, oh yeah, this doesn't taste nearly as good as mine. Mine's way better. And you couldn't change people's minds. You could not change people's minds. Once they had a brand, that was it. That was their brand. What's wrong with having an opinion? What's wrong with these people feeling confident about what they like? For God's sake, they can like something. Well, they did this big taste test where all the big major manufacturers got together and they had people taste the cigarettes who had a brand in mind, and they found that they couldn't tell the difference. That these people tasting these cigarettes would point to one and say, oh yes, this is definitely my brand. And they would be wrong, except for in chance situations. That they were statistically exactly the same as chance. They're unable to pick their cigarette. Where does this loyalty come from? Where does this spirit come from of identification with a cigarette brand? And that's when cigarette companies really started marketing based on image. They knew that the image was what you were going for. And they started sinking their money into how to create images to get people cornered in a certain market, the way they see themselves as some sort of hotshot cowboy, some sort of cosmopolitan playboy, some sort of like elegant woman. They would get you to position yourself to be at one with the image they were creating. And then all these little labels start coming out for all these little tiny subcultures and stuff like that. Wine is the same way. People act like they're absolutely brilliant with wine and they can tell one from the other and everything like that. Turns out all you have to do is dye the wine to have this illusion completely disappear. That people in their confidence and what they're tasting is they're off the wall wrong about what brand is what and what goes with what cheese or whatever. All you have to do is present that little tiny bit of doubt. Where it's really interesting is in investing. There's a lot of different reasons for this, and we'll talk about it again later when we talk about regression to the mean. But that when you're investing your money in stocks for a retirement account, say, or something like that, you get these economists to pick a bunch of stocks. Okay, so let's say that Joe over here goes to an economist and somebody he's heard of before, who's studied economy, and he's going to pick stocks for Joe, and he picks a bunch of stocks. And then Jill goes to a monkey. Well, not a monkey, an ape, chimpanzee. Chimpanzees don't have tails. That's how you know they're an ape. So she goes to a chimpanzee, and the chimpanzee is going to pick stocks. And they're going to give the chimpanzee a marker, and they're going to give him a list of stocks, and they're going to have him highlight 7 of them. And that's what the economist is going to do too. Over time, the chimpanzee and the economist perform at about the same. Literally. What are we doing with economists? What are we doing with investors? Why do they exist if they perform no better than a monkey? How is it that these economists, these big-time economists, can get on television and talk you through what's going on during a financial crisis, but they can't see a financial crisis coming? They miss the financial crisis coming. And yet, they're able to apply hindsight to make it look like, oh no, all the writing was on the wall, and if we missed it, it was out of chance, and nobody expected this part to happen, but look, and it's because people, the most respected economists, they have the right words, they've studied the right thing, and they're able to make a coherent story that looks like a very clear-cut relationship of cause and effect that led us to where we are. It's that coherent storytelling that makes them so powerful, that makes them listened to. That confidence in their opinion is always in hindsight. And if something dramatic happens that they predicted, there, I knew it. And if something doesn't, then they might pretend that they knew, because in hindsight, it looks like all those pieces would have fallen into place. We are really driven to narratives. We're really driven to stories. And when somebody can sit down and show you this happened and this happened and then this happened, then all of a sudden the story takes place in your mind where you go, well, of course this housing crisis was going to happen. It seemed inevitable. There were no points where we could have changed course. And that's, again, this is the power of being a person. That what a person can do is tell a story. You tell a story about what a cigarette company means, and people buy. You tell a story about what wine makes you sophisticated, and people buy. You tell a story about what economic structures are in play, and people buy into it. And that's why everything makes so much sense when you're looking backwards. And you look backwards and you go, well, we should have listened to someone. Somebody should have known. And so let me pay this guy. He'll tell me. But that cause and effect isn't always there. The confidence is. And the storytelling is. And the justifications are. And we're going to get deep into justifications and cognitive dissonance. But the point I want to make right now is that if you want to find out about this world in which you are immersed, you first must realize that you're wrong about it. That you're wrong about it, and that your instant reaction to things is going to get you through about 90% of a normal day. But when it comes to learning something or applying knowledge, it's going to be a lot harder. We found that, you teach psychology to students. You teach them a concept about altruism. You teach them a concept about, helping out strangers, or, how few people will actually call 911 when they witness something terrible happen, because of the assumption that somebody else is handling the situation and you don't have to. And you find out that a really low percentage of people is willing to help out somebody, be a good Samaritan in a disastrous situation. Most people will just walk on by, or leave, or stand around and wait for somebody else to take care of it and keep an eye on things. And that good Samaritans essentially don't really exist on average. I think, what is it? It's about 12% of people in most situations will stop and help. 12% of people will call the police, whatever it is. Don't get me nailed down on numbers here. It's something pathetic. And yet, you teach a psychology student all of this, and they learn it, and then you show an interview with somebody. You show an interview where they talk about themselves, where they're from, they talk about their dog, they talk about their kids, whatever, and say, okay, so would this person be a good Samaritan? Would this person come to somebody's aid? And the psychology student should say, no, because almost 90% of people wouldn't. And you're just showing me somebody who's not giving me any new information besides the fact that maybe I like them. Maybe they seem compassionate, they seem cool, and they seem like, anybody with a dog isn't a jerk. But they will completely miss the point of what they're learning in their psychology class. And they will assume that their gut feeling about someone is the same as information about someone. And it's not. And that's the whole point of psychology. That's the whole point of what they're studying. And they'll miss it. Because they are in their normal life now. They're not in school, so they're not compartmentalizing their thinking. And they feel like they have a feeling about someone. So in order to get an accurate picture, you have to turn off that. You have to turn off that confidence. You have to turn off that notion that you're right. And you have to turn on that deeper system of thinking. Essentially, a little alarm should go off that says, you are not dealing with something normal, you're dealing with algebra. Use your algebra brain. Use the part of you that dealt with quadratic equation. Use the part of you that dealt with, the side angle side theorem or something like that. This is not going to be normal. And that's why we should be learning all of this stuff in school. It's not just to check off little boxes and react to stress in the right ways and follow directions in the right ways and to show that you had the money and time to put through, 4, 5, 6 years to get from point A to point B. That's the faulty cause and effect. It should be that it's transformative. That it changes the way you interact with the world because you're not quite so egotistical. You're not quite so arrogant. You're not quite so certain. It's a hard thing to do because these hard truths aren't pleasant. And we love what's pleasant. But you can do it, right? You're different.